Hi, this is Corey Johnston, and today's lesson is going to take place in Isaiah's second chapter. And here we read of 2:1 things, the establishment of the heavenly kingdom on earth, and also the day of Yahweh. The day of Yahweh is alternately a day of calamity and cursings to the wicked and unrepentant, but it is also a day of blessing and rejoicing for those who are spared of the judgment, those who meet the conditions of repentance and respond responsibly to the revelation. So we do want to bear in mind that the day of Yahweh is prior to the establishment of his kingdom. When his kingdom comes, there will be no evil left on earth, because evil cannot exist apart from people. And if evil people are eliminated, then he will be unmolested to rule in his righteous rule, uncontaminated by the adversary who will be in the bottomless pit at this time. He's going to be released at the end of the millennium, but that's getting a little far outside of the text. And speaking of that, there's one or two ways I could take this. I could either review chapter 1, but my fear is that there are 22 verses in this chapter. We do try and confine these to less than 30 minutes just for the sake of duplicatability. And if I do that, I don't think I'm going to have enough time to really give the chapter itself the full focus it deserves. So what I'm going to do is maybe reference the first chapter throughout the reading of the second. And that being said, we're going to remember what I said, that the establishment of the kingdom comes after the day of Yahweh. So the opening verse of the second chapter reads, "The word that Isaiah, the son of Amos, saw concerning Judah and Jerusalem." So what's interesting here is that he's speaking of a word that he saw, and this brings us to the opening verse of the opening chapter, the visions of Isaiah, son of Amos. He identifies himself by the same name, which he saw, but a vision entails a visual element. So there are two distinct categories of revelation. One is through a voice, which entails no visible revelatory manifestations, just the voice of divinity is speaking directly and tangibly to you in the fullest sense. But here, most visions do contain a voice to either explain it, or they are witnessing people in a future scenario interacting, or heavenly beings through whom the interaction is brought about. And this vision, he's writing his immediate audience, and his specific audience is Judah and Jerusalem. Isaiah was a citizen of both, and a resident of the former and a resident of the latter. But we must not interpret what comes out in a mere narrow nationalistic lens. He has an element of saying all the nations. So this is really global in dimension, but he's telling it to his immediate audience, the covenant people. "And it shall be in the latter days that the mountain of the house of Yahweh is established on the top of the mountains, and shall be exalted above the hills, and all nations shall flow to it." So in the latter days, that is not yet, the latter days can mean one of two things. It can mean the present dispensation, or the days which are ahead of us. And of course, this monumental event has yet to be established, so we can say the same thing as he did, that it is latter days. This is a yet to be fulfilled prophecy. This comes towards the end, and all nations shall flow to it. So Jerusalem will be the tourist center of the world, but they will fulfill their Abrahamic blessing of blessing all the nations. So the house of Yahweh, that is his temple, or more fully him, will be exalted above all the hills and all the mountains, and restored to its rightful place where he belongs. "And many people shall come and say, Come and let us go up to the mountain of Yahweh, to the houses of Elohim, of the Elohim of Jacob, and let him teach us his ways, and let us walk in his paths. For out of Zion comes forth the law, and the word of Yahweh from Jerusalem." So these many peoples from disparate locations and all over the world are coming to Jerusalem. So this is concerning them, but it's ultimately not only about them. He's telling them in the final days all the Gentiles will share the worship with you. And they're going to be thrilled and loving the fact that they are able to learn from the Creator, that is the Yahweh, the Elohim of Jacob, is unlike the gods of the Gentiles who were born in the minds of the Gentiles and made in the image of man and beast and bull and sea creatures et al., etc. But this is the real, the authentic one, and they are thrilled for the opportunity to learn his ways and walk in his paths, and they recognize that Zion is the site and center from whom the blessings of the law and the word of Yahweh from Jerusalem emanate and flow from. So they are in the right place, and they are grateful to be there, and they are loving it. Whereas the apostate generation of Isaiah's time had, they didn't have the temple as exalted as it is described here, but they had all the blessings of the revelation. They had the law, they had the prophets. They rejected them, they scorned them, they persecuted them, they killed them. Isaiah, according to legend, was sawed in half by the sadistic monarch Manasseh, of whose name we don't read in the second opening verse. In the days of Uzziah, Jotham, Ahaz, Hezekiah, kings of Jerusalem. Hezekiah was the father of Manasseh. So his prophetic ministry, it takes place in the, I think in the 6th chapter, it's in the final years of the first mentioned king. So his prophetic ministry spans the range of some 40 years. And he shall judge between the nations, and he shall reprove many peoples, and they shall beat their swords into plowshares, and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation shall not lift up swords against nation, neither teach battle any more. So the first thing we read is that, this is the day of judgment. He sits on his throne, and he will issue and decree the judgment to determine our eternal destinies and fates. And many people are going to be reproved. Some are going to be more fortunate. But in this future scenario, there will be no need for warfare. Therefore, the sciences and the human pursuits into warfare and developing more sophisticated military technologies will no longer be necessary, because war is, the science of war is stimulated by the fact of war. And if there's no war, you're not going to have human minds oriented on instruments of death and destruction when they can live in peace and harmony. So war is not necessary when you have perfect peace and perfect harmony. This is going to be a reversal of the world as we currently know it, where all the nations are oriented and geared towards war against just about every other, or some nation somewhere in the world at any given time, and many, in fact, are at war and at each other's throats. But that's not going to be a reality. It's not going to, the enmity between nations, individuals, the lion and the lamb, for instance, in this blessed present day, will not be at war or enmity with each other anymore. O house of Jacob, come and let us walk in the light of Yahweh. Now, the light of Yahweh is not anything we can manufacture or produce. It is something we can find and discover through diligence, and the light is his revelation. These are to guide our feet and determine where we go, who we are, what we say, what we do. So the light of Yahweh it comes from him, it emanates from him, it belongs to him, and we can claim it, but we have to discover it, and it does demand diligence. But the house of Jacob, that would have been the nation of Israel, had these things, yet did not utilize them or make the most of them, collectively not at least. For you have forsaken your people, the house of Jacob, because they have been filled from the east and practice magic like the Philistines, and they are pleased with the children of foreigners. So the east would have been the primary threat. It's not until the Greeks come that Judah and Israel and the Jewish people find themselves at the mercy of Western civilization. And even though Judeo-Christianity has sort of defined Western civilization, it is in fact born of a very Eastern place. So Israel, in the monarchical period, when they had an independent nation to call their own, the threats in their worldview was centered towards the east, not the west, because there was the Mediterranean Sea at its western border. So they were and the tabernacle was aligned to the east, where the sun also rose. But these eastern practices, the Philistines, they were actually from the west. They were of Grecian descent, but they are identified with the east, not if not in origin, then certainly in settlement. But magic is one of the forbidden practices as outlined by Moses in Deuteronomy 18:9 through 14. If he says anyone dabbling in them, get him out of there. There's no place for this type of activity, the spiritist, astrologers, et al., etc. So all these esoteric religious practices, wizardry, sorcery, witchcraft, all that, there's to be none of that in a Judeo-Christian country. But, one of the things in America and Western civilization in general is that we are being invaded by the Eastern and esoteric religious practices, which are contaminating, I feel, the purity of our faith. And this is one of the challenges of living in a religiously pluralistic society. And Israel, at least on paper, and Judah were not religiously pluralistic, but they did allow, through their own volition, they did invite and practice forbidden religious practices. They were to be a one religion nation, but that was the ideal. It wasn't always that way. And their land is filled with silver and gold, and there is no end to their treasures. And their land is filled with horses, and there is no end to their chariots. So this is unlimited wealth beyond what is necessary. The land is filled with silver and gold. You can walk in it. You can put your hand down and it'll be there. There is literally no end or limitation to the treasures. And these ought not be interpreted as silver and gold, because the kingdom it diminishes the value of worldly treasure. Heavenly treasures triumph and transcend the earthly treasures. But horses, the same thing. There is no end to their horses and chariots. Their lands are filled and flooded with horses, and the ancients would have valued horses more than we moderns. Horses have become almost obsolete since the invention of the horseless carriage. But to the ancients, this was their means to and fro, that and camels, at least in Israel. So horses were extremely useful, and they did advance the spread of civilization faster than if man was left on his own feet. He could not have advanced civilization as fast or as far as we did. And their land is filled with idols. They bow themselves to the work of their own hands, to do what their own fingers have made. So idolatry was not permitted, not tolerated, not welcome in the covenant community. This is the worship of a morally inferior and morally and metaphysically non-existent figment of a human imagination. Remember, if we are made in the image of God, then idols are gods made in the image of man. They are reflective of our own black perverted hearts. There is no moral purity to them. They are human teenagers on bitter, vengeful quest that sometimes have devastating ripple effects on the earth. And they are the products of their own fingers. Once more, they are our creations, whereas we are created by the one who is invisible and cannot be depicted in physical likeness or representatives. Of course, he does have the physical self when he came in the incarnation, but that's getting a little far outside the text. And the lowly bows down, and the high is humbled. Therefore you do not bear them. So the perfect paradox of the those who exalt themselves being humbled, as expressed in the New Testament, Matthew 23:12, Luke 14:11, and 18:14, is that they will not be so high that they will not be humbled at this day, and we will not have to bear their arrogance, their pride, their conceit, anything else, because the lowly will be bowed down naturally, and the high, those who are inclined to exalt themselves at the expense of others, will be humbled, and we will not have to suffer the deleterious consequences of coexisting in a society with proud and arrogant people. So pride, human sin, and wickedness are not going to be the barriers. There's not going to be pride or the need for war or anything else in this blessed day. Enter into that rock and hide in the dust because of the fear of Yahweh and the splendor of his excellencies. So the rock is the source of refuge, safety, and protection, because we are to, and this is the natural cause of having fear of Yahweh in the splendor, even the thought of the splendor of his majesties, which goes so beyond the depths, dimensions, and details that we can logically fathom, that ought to stimulate a fear in us, because humankind fears the unknown, and we are, fear for Yahweh is okay. A mature believer's sense of love will exceed their sense of fear, but it's not appropriate to lose the sense of that fear as you walk further and further with him. As you grow to love him, your fear of him should not diminish. No matter how far and fast and spiritually mature you may become, you don't want to lose the fear that is our rightful due reverence and due deference to him. The fear of Yahweh is the fear which eliminates and expels all other fear. So it puts our fears into perspective. The lofty looks of a man shall be humbled, and the pride of men shall be bowed down, and Yahweh alone shall be exalted in that day. So the human sin of pride was actually Lucifer's sin was pride, and pride compelled him to grasp after that which belonged to Elohim, and was a blasphemous usurpation on his half, but he was exalted. He tried to exalt himself, but he was thrown straight to the ground. We read of in Isaiah's chapter, I shall be like the Most High, but you are brought straight to the grave, he says in the 14th chapter. But pride is something that humans are not immune to. It's not an exclusively angelic or demonic sin. Human pride in their achievements, in their wealth, in their accumulations of objects or resources or anything else does create a palpable temptation, because when you are you are proudful in yourself. Pride is always selfish. So, pride in your country is not sinful, but pride in yourself is. For Yahweh of hosts has a day against all that is proud and lofty, against all that is lifted up, so that it is brought low. So the balancing and then the judgment will be brought into balance at this day of the day of Yahweh. That's the day of reckoning and also the day of resurrection. But it is both, and at the same time, it's different things to different people. But those who are proud in heart or arrogant in demeanor or condescending in tone will be brought low. They will they will be humiliated, and humiliation and humility are two similar. They both share the same etymological root, the being rooted in the Latin word for humus, which means ground. So a humble person will naturally, they have the internal mechanism to, not be down to earth, roughly translated, whereas the humbles have to have their humiliation, them being brought to the ground and the earth by an external agent. So, we who are humble will not have to worry about being brought to where we already are, but the proud will be reversal. So their estimation of themselves is up here, but in the divine estimation, it's a reversal. And against all the cedars of Lebanon that are high and lifted up, and against all the oaks of Bashan. So cedars and Lebanons are two types of trees. They are both strong. Cedars are especially tall, and they were a unique source to Lebanon. That's the neighboring nation to the north, the modern country. It was referred to by the ancients and perhaps themselves as Phoenicia, but here it is Lebanon, and we're not exactly aware of the location of Bashan, but we do know that it was near Israel. We're not going to comment on that, which we do not know. And against all the high mountains, and against all the hills are lifted up, and against every lofty tower, and against every strong wall, and against all the ships of Tarshish, and against all their desirable craft. So all these things that are exalted and esteemed and acclaimed by humans are of nothing and are worthless compared to the one who is truly esteemed and exalted. And our exaltation can only be produced by him. It is a divine work from start to finish. And but every lofty tower, everything that is raised above the parameters and limitations as established and decreed by divinity, will be brought low. And So everything, all the desirable craft that's not going to be desirable to people with heavenly appetites when the kingdom comes and the day of judgment comes. So all the ships of Tarshish, this was their port town. They weren't exactly a seafaring people, but they compared to the Phoenicians at least. But the Israelites' port of access was Tarshish. That's where Jonah fled, tried to go all the way to Joppa, which was past the Gibraltar, the end of the earth. And Tarshish was also the site and location where Cornelius, the Roman centurion, was converted by Peter. And the loftiness of man shall be bowed down, and the pride of men shall be brought low, and Yahweh alone shall be exalted in that day. So again, the sin of pride is ultimately grasping for an exaltation that doesn't belong to you. The only one who is worthy and even deserves to be exalted is the one who is eternally exalted, but he can be diminished in our own estimations and expectations, but we will be diminished in that day of judgment if we think less than him, if we do not care for the things of the heavens and theology and everything else. Then we're going to be right where we belong in hell, because these are the people that, if they don't enjoy and embrace the heavenly gifts and the glimpses and taste of heaven on earth, they will be more at home in hell. And the idols completely pass away. So there's going to be no need, just like there's no need for warfare when you're basking and dwelling and residing in the presence of divinity. You're not going to have an idol there, because you have the real, authentic experience, and you're not going to bow down to a physically and morally and metaphysically inferior entity in the day that you are there. And they shall go into the holes of the rocks and into the caves of the earth, from the dread of Yahweh and the splendor of his excellency, when he arises to shake the earth mightily. So this event is going to be physically calamitous. It's going to be a event of spiritual significance, but it's ultimately going to be felt physically. The day of Yahweh now is alternately likened to the second coming, which the Savior himself describes as lightning shines from the east and even from the west. So shall also the coming of the Son of Man be, in Matthew's 24th chapter. So in either case, earthquakes and, shaking the earth, he can shake the entire earth at once. So earthquakes are typically local locations, but this is going to be a shaking of the earth outside of its normal. So that's how we're going to know that the day of Yahweh is upon us, and it is here, and there's no escaping it once it comes. In that day men shall throw away his idols of silver and his idols of gold, which they made, each for himself, to worship, to the moles and the bats. So men, in this day, men are going to have a tangible revelation and witness and a feeling of this divine superior power. They're going to know that the idols are worthless and useless and of no value. And they're going to toss them straight in the garbage to the moles and the bats. So that means they're going to be worm food and fertilizer. Or they're just going to diminish depending on what they're made of. Silver, gold obviously have a longer shelf life than wood and clay. But, some idols were adorned with silver and gold. Some were completely silver and gold. But even a block of pure gold is as worthless and as nothing compared to the presence of the Almighty, which even the idolater will feel on the day that, a day of Yahweh. To go into the clefts of the rocks and into the crags of the rugged rocks, because of the fear of Yahweh and the splendor of his excellency, when he arises to shake the earth mightily. So if we already fear Yahweh, we will not fear him on that day, but those who neglected, laughed, ridiculed, dismissed even the idea or concept of divinity will be rudely awakened, and the fear will be stimulated in them, because they will know it is the one they have denied and the one they have rejected and the one they have forsaken and the one they have rebelled against that is acting on them. They will have an instant and total revelation that will expose all their layers of doubt and semi-sophisticated malarkey, intellectual hogwash that eliminates the concept of a creator. from the human mind, because the earth will be shaking literally around them. They will be convulsing in it, and they will be at the mercy of the one they did not fear, but that fear will be stimulated in them out of necessity and emergency. So if we fear Yahweh now, we will not fear his judgment. And that's when the wicked, the fear of Yahweh, comes to us no matter what. And better to have it now in this life than to have it when it's too late. Cease from man, whose breath is in his nostrils, for in what is he to be reckoned upon? So this is the closing verse of the chapter we're going to be covering today. And man, there's a qualitative chasm between divinity, who is by definition perfect and eternally so, whereas man is imperfect and frail and fleeting and temporal and temporary. Our breath is in his nostrils. The length of our life is likened to a breath of the air in its brevity. And so who are we to exalt ourselves or any of us among us to the rightful station that divinity and Yahweh properly belong to and are reserved for? So it puts our priorities into perspective, and this also, incidentally, much of Isaiah's indictments of the secular rulers of his Jerusalem and Judah, where they were placing their faith in alliances between Egypt and Assyria and everything else, and Babylon, but their faith was in these Gentile powers, and that was compromising their exclusivity and the reliability of their faithful walk and witness and work for the one who they should be serving by right and duty. And that's all the time we have for today. Thank you so much. I'm so glad you're here. Stay tuned until next time. I'll see you then. Bye-bye.